Welcome to the IT in Motion podcast, where we make technology exciting and informative. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Josh. We're your hosts. Today we're talking to Mike Nappi, Chief Product Officer at ScienceLogic. Everybody give it up for Mike. So Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Josh, Patrick, good to see you guys. It's good to be here. So I'm the Chief Product and Engineering Officer at ScienceLogic, coming up on 5 years now with the company, and thrilled to be with you guys.
We're really excited to have you here. All right, Mike. Well, we'd like to get everyone to know you a little bit. I know you've got a lot of experience in the industry, and we'd like to ask you to tell a couple horror stories that you've experienced through the theme of the classical elements, earth, wind, water, and fire.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, I've probably got a few stories like that, Josh, but one that comes to mind off the bat is combining fire and water. I remember vividly being at Microsoft in the late 90s, not to date myself, but we had a pretty significant storm. This would have been like over the winter. And I came into work, and you see the Redmond Fire Department there. And we had a data center that adjoined our building. And the storm had resulted in a broken main, and there was a flood in the data center. And there was also a fire that was happening because of sparks generated by the flooding. And not a good situation. I go in there, and I was able to get access to the data center area before the fire people had kind of disembarked. And I found my test manager hung precariously off of a ladder trying to shut the main power off to the data center. Just not a good, it blew every OSHA policy out of the water. Not a good situation to walk into first thing in a Monday morning. But long story short, he ended up using a broom handle to disengage the main power and saved, most of the data center. The Redmond Fire Department was able to put out the fire, and everything was fine. But I got to tell you, it was pretty exciting beginning to the week.
That's quite exciting. My fire story would be, it wasn't a data center I was at. It was a data center across the country. It was in Seattle, so not too far from Redmond. And it was a data center called Fisher Plaza, and it was the primary site for Authorize.net, who at the time handled about 3/4 of transactions for credit cards on the internet. It was on the 4th of July, and I happened to be working, and all of a sudden all these support desk tickets came in about, hey, I can't check out, I can't do anything. And as it turns out, they'd had a bad fire at that data center, and it took them most of the day to move to their backup location. So wasn't so much a disaster for me. For me, it was mostly, hey, just wait till tomorrow. But I can't imagine what that did to commerce on the internet. A whole day of most transactions failing.
Yeah, my story is actually a combination of two, a little bit like Mike's, only this one it's earth and water. So it's same data center story, right? Everything's working fine, and then all of a sudden we lost our main WAN link, and it didn't fail over to the backup. So there was a magic panic. Identified that the config wasn't set up correctly, so the team was struggling to fix that. At the same time, everyone runs outside to see what's going on, and you can imagine what's sitting out there at the curb. There's a backhoe, right? So the backhoe has cut through the fiber, as is always the case, the ultimate outage generator. Only what made it really exciting was there's now 2 or 3 of us geeks standing around the backhoe. There's a whole lot of people that are really excited to come and ask what had happened. And so the backhoe operator gets nervous, and he starts trying to excavate the hole out a little bit bigger, because now he's been told that the team is going to come out and do a splice on the fiber. But as he is now cutting alongside the cut fiber, he cuts a water line, which then fills the hole entirely up with water. So it added about an extra 3 hours of pumping to get down to do the splice. Backhoes can fix anything.
Oh man.
Yeah. Well, they're the natural predator of the internet, right?
The ultimate stealer of packets.
That's right. So does anyone have a wind story? That's the tough one. Hurricanes, all the data centers I worked with in Miami did great. Even when the big storm came through New York, it wasn't the wind that got us, it was flooding, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
wind doesn't. I haven't seen too many issues with wind. It tends to be water, fire. The data center one, right? A great example. And and Mike, how much of that data center actually burned? Was it contained to a rack or a cage, or like what was the total scope there?
It actually, I don't think we had any fundamental loss. We lost a couple. We did lose a couple racks due to water damage, but the water created a short, which in turn triggered a fire alarm in the data center, which is why the Redmond Fire Department was summoned. But there was it never really expanded beyond that. The biggest issue was the water and shutting off the some of the safety control valves in the data center, which would have caused even more water
Right.
damage.
Yeah,
Had they not been
it's really
triggered. So,
tricky with the data center when there's a panic. And actually, I think I've got a story for wind, only it'll be gas in this case, which is remember halon suppression
yeah,
back in the day? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
yeah,
Sun Microsystems back in the day here in Austin at the lab, and somebody decided during a tour to point at the fire suppression panel, and in the process managed to set off the halon in the data center. Everything kept running. He didn't hit the one that actually killed the power at the same time. So the two admins that were in there most of the time grabbed him, the two people who were part of the tour, and dragged everybody out of there as quickly as they possibly can and shut the door doors on the halon filled room. So it's gas. It doesn't count as wind, but it's close.
I think the ancient Greeks would
yeah.
have counted halon as a form of wind. So
Yeah.
Mike, would you mind sharing with us a little bit about your career history?
Sure. Yeah, my career is really comprised of three chapters. I spent, I really kind of cut my teeth in the early days at Microsoft. I was at Microsoft for 16 years. Started off as a lowly program manager / developer, and worked my way up the ladder to like the end of the 90s. I was running product units, which in Microsoft parlance is kind of the minimum viable product team or unit. You have program management, you have engineering, you have documentation, you have UI, UX, and you were responsible for delivering a product into the Microsoft machine, and Microsoft would essentially localize it, blast it out across the world. So it was a great experience. Learned a lot about team leadership and product and so forth. In 2011, I decided to take a new. I got an offer from this small little startup down in Southern California. It was in Solana Beach, a single little building at the time in Solana Beach, from a company called ServiceNow. And at that time, nobody had heard of these guys. And I was like, what an odd name for a company. It sounds like a janitorial services or something. I didn't know what it was about. But a guy that I used to work with at Microsoft, he left Microsoft previously and was hired on as their first CTO. And so he reached out to me and said, hey, they've got a good thing going down here. You might want to check it out. My wife and I had been up in Seattle for 18 years. Moving down to Southern California seemed like an interesting change of pace. And so we packed up the kids and moved down to San Diego in 2012. And I joined that company. And needless to say, that was kind of a rocket ship. It was crazy. They IPO'd later that year, and then they went through this incredible hockey stick of growth. So that was a cool experience to be a part of. They really started off when I first got there. It was everybody was in the single 2 floors of this building, and at lunchtime, everybody went out to the ocean and surfed, came back, put their boards in their office, and began coding again. This included the founder, Fred Luddy. And he used to hang out in the office I was in because it had this really bad green Naugahyde couch that for whatever reason he really liked to code on. So he would lay back on that couch and code and crack really bad off-color HR violation style jokes while he coded. And so that was kind of life in 2012, 2013. And of course, Fred's now a multi-billionaire, something like that. He's got a Gulfstream 5, by the way, which he's relabeled FredX. So he runs people around in his Gulfstream, but that company's a pretty amazing success story. So I was there for 6 years. I left at the end of 2017. Took some time off, and then Dave Link at ScienceLogic reached out to me a couple times. First time I was still kind of enjoying some time off, and then he stayed with it, and we talked some more. And I was really excited about what ScienceLogic had done to solve what I considered the hardest problem in IT, which is really having a authoritative system of record around what's actually deployed in an increasingly complex IT estate. Because unless you have something that's reasonably comprehensive in real time, all the machine learning in the world is going to be reasoning over incomplete or stale data. So it doesn't really matter. So I was intrigued by what ScienceLogic had built over the course of their history to solve that and have essentially that's a fairly authoritative IT data lake that represents reality. So I was excited to come on board. I joined in 2019, initially as kind of a pure play CPO, and then subsequently took over engineering as well. And so it's been a fun ride ever since.
Well, thanks again for being with us. It is just great to have you on, and welcome to the green couch for the podcast. So, just, you've seen so much in your career, right? And you've watched the emergence of AI, artificial intelligence, and increasingly in operations roles. I mean, I think at this point, it's almost put on cereal boxes now at the grocery store. It's pretty much everywhere. You can't, get an app for your phone at this point that doesn't have it. But for IT operations, it's still new, right? And that landscape of how the products work together, the capabilities, and how admins would actually use it. Like if you're also a leader, in IT and you are going to deploy AI, what are you expecting to do with it, right? So what do you see like from a category perspective of how artificial intelligence is actually being used on the ground in IT?
Well, I think I'll caveat this by saying the journey is just getting started. Right. So there's still, in spite of all the hype, and you're right, Patrick, there's a lot of it out there. We are just now beginning to see just the incredible game-changing impacts that AI ML, and in particular generative AI, can play in an IT domain. But I think the IT space lends itself actually quite well to generative AI and the promise of AI ML in general. And that is because what AI does particularly well is it rapidly distills order out of chaos. It rapidly understands across a very diverse set of complex landscape what is useful, what is important for a human to understand and act upon. And if you think about the journey of IT for the last several decades, the fundamental use cases of IT have not changed. It's been, traditionally, what do I have? How is it related? Like, how is it combining compute, storage, and network to actually deliver some kind of service to the end user, to the business? What's going on with it? What's going wrong? And more importantly, of all the things that are going wrong, what are the things I should pay attention to first? What's going to have the most material impact to the business? And if you think about it, really all the tools, just the hundreds and hundreds of tools that have spooled up over the decades, have been around answering these core questions in different ways. But I mean, fundamentally, that's it. And what's happened is we've seen an incredible rise in complexity in the last 10 years, driven by microservices, by containers, by migration to the cloud, by agile methodologies like CI/CD that has radically increased the rate of change of applications. So all these things have conspired to make the traditional job of IT far more intractable because you just have so many moving parts, so much change happening in the environment. And AI ML, and in particular generative AI, has arrived on the scene just in time because, frankly, it's no longer tenable for a number of humans, doesn't matter how many, to be sitting in a traditional NOC, staring at heartbeat monitors, telling them the relative, health of compute, storage, networking, and applications in the environment. You just can't get ahead. You can't move in machine time fast enough to actually do things to prevent an outage, let alone proactively optimizing that environment. It's still the case today, by the way. This is kind of shocking to me because I've been in this space for a long time, as you guys both have as well. But I mean, the standard, the state of the art for when a service goes down is a bunch of people hopping on a Slack channel. And it's bring your own tool day. Everybody's trying to figure out, what's going on, looking at different parts of the elephant. But it's this highly expensive and manual operation involving humans going, well, looks like the network's okay. How's databases looking? This is
Meantime
very
to
inefficient.
innocence.
And the reality, it is. It's still responsible for 70% of MTTR today is this kind of hunting and pecking. And yes, the tools have gotten better, but you're still getting a bunch of humans together, comparing notes and trying to find the needle in the haystack. And I think the promise of AI/ML, what it's generative AI in particular, what it's uniquely good at, is separating the signal from the noise and bubbling up and replacing those human analytical cycles with machine-generated insight that's saying, hey, based on the data exhaust that I've ingested and correlated with these other data sources, I can tell you these are the 3 things that are going on right now in your environment. And here's the number 1 thing that you need to pay attention to. And oh, by the way, this thing that's going on, it's likely based on historical data that's related to XYZ. So you might want to take this sort of remediation, which you did in the past, right? Generative AI can bring together the institutional knowledge, if you will, and combine that institutional knowledge with the data exhaust that's coming out of the environment and render a highly informed and oftentimes accurate insight around what's going on, and more importantly, what you should do.
Data exhaust. We're back to gases and wind again. It's really interesting. The point there in terms of not having enough humans to really manually go in and operate. If we were operating IT, comprehensively 10 years ago, which is still debatable, right? There was a lot of gaps, but IT budgets never go up; they only go down. And so the question there is, AI doesn't look like, for operations, doesn't look like it was a technology going to solve a problem. And instead it was sort of pulled by IT to help solve that problem of just not having enough hands and having, at the same time that you have this explosion in new data. Think about it, like we've gone from a world where we did maintenance windows on the weekends. You'd have to come in and just do all of it Saturday and Sunday to get it all done, to now with, as you mentioned, CI/CD, you have teams bragging about how many deployments they can do in a day. Like, well, we do 5,000 in a day. Okay, great. Microservices. That's awesome. But that velocity of change has exacerbated that problem of that we were already, not staffed at where we needed to be. And so AI seems to be a way of really addressing that. Now, you've mentioned generative AI a couple of times. Would you just take a second and explain the difference between that and maybe what a lot of folks are more familiar with, which would be anomaly detection maybe, or some other data analysis that's a little bit more sort of ML, sort of classic AI and math, essentially, and why generative AI is different, especially in IT?
Yeah. AI, ML techniques have been around for a very long time. And what we've seen really in the last 10 years is a commercialization of stuff that's existed in academia for over, 3 decades probably. And really, as you pointed out, Patrick, in the early part of the AI/ML journey, it was really taking statistical algorithms, right. Bayesian algorithms and other types of algorithms, and really just applying them over the data lake, over the big data repository, wherever you've got your data, and using those algorithms to reason over the data and bubble up, non-intuitive insights based on those various statistical algorithms, right? And the most common one is, as you pointed out, anomaly detection, as opposed to using a priori policy thresholds, essentially reasoning over time series metrics data and determining where there is anomalous behavior based on seasonal patterns, right? Which would be difficult to codify into some sort of policy engine. So an early application of AI/ML has been reasoning over in the past metrics data and determining where there have been things that have essentially been abnormal, right? And using that signal to inform what might be going on more broadly with the system. The other use case is you can extrapolate from that same body of data and develop essentially predictions around when you're likely to run out of capacity based on trends that are materializing in the data. And again, all these things are fairly well understood applications of statistical algorithmic techniques. They're just applied to metrics data in this case, or other types of IT data. Where generative AI, I think, really changes the game is at the core of generative AI is this new data aggregation and storage mechanism of the large language model. And the large language model, or the GPT approach, which was, has been popularized recently with ChatGPT, essentially allows for unsupervised training at scale, not just on a narrow subset of data like metrics data coming out of IT, but importantly across disparate data sources. And so now for the first time, you can essentially easily marry kind of numerical data, if you will, like metrics or time series data, with unstructured data like documents, and connect those two using some of the affordances that you have in large language model technology. The other thing that these models provide essentially is the ability to have a natural language interface on top of them that allows you to query and get a response in human language readable terms. So it makes, for the first time, a disparate set of data, first of all, gets correlated, and it makes that totality of data available to an end user in a very intuitive fashion. And ChatGPT was essentially trained on the corpus of the internet, if you will, and then expose this natural language interface, and that's shown the power of this thing. Now, the downside of it, like any emergent technology, is there are problems with sometimes the data and or the insights that are coming out of that data. And there's an inherent problem in GPT styles of training that create hallucinations, meaning the system does not like to deal with gaps. It doesn't know how to deal with gaps in the data. So it'll try and spackle over the gaps in sort of non-intuitive, non-predictive ways. And so right now that's and there's a lot of science going into essentially minimize the hallucination or detecting it when it happens, that sort of thing. But that's a natural part of any new technology evolution. But anyway, that's the high line, and really bringing, I think the promise and the hype is, if you can imagine bringing the totality of an institution's combined corporate institutional knowledge and make that accessible not only to a highly trained, let's say, SRE engineer that's been around with the company for 5 years, they've learned where all the bodies are buried, they know how to diagnose problems, but somebody that just came in the door that's a level one, and making that same body of knowledge accessible to that level one person, it's a force multiplier for human capital. It makes human capital far more effective. And so I think that's that's the potential of this thing, among other things.
I think that's interesting, right? I see a couple parallels with for example, stock trading, right? Moving from, you've got the sort of technical traders, right, who look at, okay, this stock is going up and it matches this pattern, therefore it's likely to go down or it's likely to go up, and they can execute trades on it. And so traditionally they've programmed things based on these patterns that they can describe. But you needed the human trader to go look at the Wall Street Journal to say, oh, the CEO is changing, and that CEO that was a great CEO, and the new one that's coming in, it's an unknown. So, maybe the stock's going to go down. And right, you've got this sort of parallel with these large language models, being able to look at that less structured information, stuff that, as a computer scientist, you know exists, but you don't really consider it information because you can't really talk to plain text. Now we can. And then that whole parallel of, mechanization, right? One one weaver can only make so much fabric, but a loom operator can make a tremendous amount of fabric. And so it's the same thing, right? We're empowering one person to bite off a lot more work. And thinking about that, those sort of parallels, right? It kind of leads me to thinking about, you know, where does that go? What are the opportunities that opens up with respect to AI and managing IT infrastructure?
Well, we've had at ScienceLogic for a while now this vision of AI ops, which is comprised of three main uh, components to it. One is having as I talked about earlier, an authoritative view of deployed reality, right? And so we're capturing via collection and so forth and aggregation what's actually out there, so that you have an accurate view of what's talking to what and so on, and then reasoning over that data to understand context and derive insights, non-intuitive insights around what's going on in the environment, and then finally connect the insights to action and drive some sort of change. If you take that as kind of the framework, okay, I don't think that framework fundamentally changes here, but I think what generative AI promises is the ability to essentially connect all those dots in a far more meaningful way. And not only the IT data, but marry that data with other institutional data to provide far richer context. Context, if you think about it, is everything. Knowing about something in isolation is of limited value. You don't know if that's anomalous or not. You don't know if that's what to make of it. But if you're able to surround an event with the context, both from the IT perspective as well as imagine from the company perspective or the sales perspective or the CRM perspective, where's this customer at this particular time in their journey? And you're able to enrich that particular event with that surround sound around what's going on with the customer that's seeing that event at the moment. You're able to make far more powerful and informed decisions based on that. And that, I think, changes, that has a whole bunch of derivative benefits if you just roll that out. But that, I think, at the end of the day, is the promise. And one of the things we're starting to talk about now at ScienceLogic is, and it's meant to be intentionally provocative, is that the technology is now matured across the three pillars I just described, along with generative AI, to make it possible to envision a platform that is truly self-healing, that it understands what it's managing, it actually has context around what it's managing, and it can make informed decisions around what it needs to do to either react to an issue that's happening in the environment in real time, or proactively optimize the environment in anticipation of some change in the future. And if you think of the generative AI capability as a far richer ability to derive insight, and then you can connect that insight to action in certain cases, you can now get to what we're calling an autonomic end state of IT operations management, where the system is actually monitoring itself, it's monitoring the IT infrastructure, it's responding to things in real time, and it's driving fixes and or optimizations back into that environment. Now, obviously, the human is in the loop here at any point that a customer cares to be. But there's certain classes of responses that may not require a human in the loop. And you have an audit trail, you can always go back and see what the system did. But maybe for only certain classes of thing, you have a human operator saying, yep, yeah, okay, I confirm that's what we want to do. And they essentially push the accept button or the big red button and make the change happen. But if you can start deflecting from humans, say 20, 30, 40% of the care and feeding of IT, you free up those humans to now focus on how do we actually take, and this was the original genesis of IT in the first place, how do we actually take this highly capitalized investment that the company has made in compute, storage, and networking and use it to radically improve the competitive stance and profile of the company, make the company far more responsive to its customers, and making the company far more competitive and profitable in their industry. So now you're turning humans loose on those problems as opposed to the day-to-day firefighting that's the traditional, sort of
It's
stereotype
interesting
that
the
I see.
way that you just describe that as autonomic as opposed to just automated, and it sounds like you're really describing a human machine hybrid, right? The human component of that is one of the key areas of collaboration that really allows that platform to really achieve things like self-healing and self-operation, self-optimization, but it does require trust, right? If the administrators do not trust the system, they are not going to go ahead and really build some gravity around automation. And so it sounds like with generative AI, especially in context, is that by presenting context to an operator, let's say a level 1 operator, for example, that can explain how these systems are related, that can explain essentially pages of unknown unknowns that have never been seen before, is that part of how they get the confidence to be able to say, yes, I'm going to automate that, or no, that's a spurious message that we don't need anymore and we should suppress that, or maybe this is something that we should run manually and observe it a couple of times before we run it, or yes, indeed, that's taken care of on its own. Like it sounds like you're saying that it's not machines come in and take over everything, and instead it's really setting free the human capital of the operations team. And ideally, you're not just allowing maybe level 1 admins to do level 3 work, but actually develop them into level 3 administrators that are really focused on delivering for the business.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think of these things, Patrick, as I think in reality, the adoption of this kind of technology is going to happen in stages, just like any significant new technology paradigm that we've seen in the last several decades. I think initially, and this is the most common sort of use case that you see out there today via ChatGPT, is generative AI is going to be used to assist humans in their traditional mode of operation. If I'm trying to understand root cause of something, I may query the AI, well, what happened yesterday that changed? Or give me a summary of changes that happened in this service over the past week. And it'll respond as it does with a quick, easy to read, human readable summary of what's been going on. So in that mode, it's kind of an assistant, right? It's sitting side by side. You see a lot of these things out there now, co-pilots, and all these around metaphors of kind of somebody that's working with you to help your job and get better at it. But as that trust element is developed, and by the way, an important aspect of developing that trust is transparency. The machine has to be able to show its work. So when it has an insight, it has to be able to say, you have to be able to click into that insight and tell me, how did you arrive at this conclusion or this insight or this recommendation? And you have to be able to go through that and be able to understand. And the good news is that IT lends itself very well to being able to triangulate on data. You could go back and pretty easily prove out what the machine is saying to you by looking at the appropriate log file or whatever it happens to be. But nevertheless, that time period needs to happen where the IT department and the individual needs to feel comfortable in the insights that are coming back from the machine. Over time, as that comfort is established, there may be certain classes of recommendations that the end user says, yep, I've seen you promote this before. I trust that you've got this correct, and go ahead and remediate that automatically moving forward, right? So I think it's going to go through the stage of kind of cautious skepticism and assistant query response type of metaphor to proactive recommendations. By the way, you don't even have to ask me a question. The machine is saying, Patrick or Josh, this is what I'm seeing today. By the way, you may not be aware of it. You may want to pay attention to these. So these things are actually being proactively promoted to you as things you may want to pay attention to. So now the machine's actually leading a little bit. And then finally, this autonomic concept that we have is that the machine, kind of similar to autonomic processes in the human body, is kind of just doing these things without you thinking about it.
It sounds a lot like, there's this question we had coming in that we we're going to discuss, right? Is it a labor saving device or a labor labor replacement device. It really sounds like what you're saying is it's a labor empowerment device, and then eventually a labor saving device, right? It lets me as an employee get more done, and then eventually it can do some stuff for me so I can focus on the harder problems.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think any disruptive technology brings with it a little bit of uncertainty and a little bit of, discomfort as you try and adapt existing processes that you've grown used to over the past 10, 15 years to the new paradigm. So there's and I remember back in the day that just any new technology coming out of Microsoft or the internet. I mean, you guys have all seen this stuff. Oh, it's gonna completely destroy these industries, and or humans are no longer going to have jobs. And what we've actually seen in reality is the reverse has been the case. We've seen greater opportunities for humans to plug in different ways. And so, will the human role eventually change as a result of this technology? No doubt it will. But I think ultimately it's going to allow humans to focus on other things that are far more important and contributing to the overall growth of the company than the care and the feeding of the IT infrastructure. That eventually will become a utility.
Love that idea of, not just being an assistant, but being an advisor, right? Where, I think we've all in our careers had, that one new hire that was just really dazzling, right? Maybe they didn't know that much about infrastructure or detailed, platforms, but they had a really good intuition and they had an amazing facility with, of course, Excel, right? But they would come to you and say, hey, I don't really know what this means. But looking at the data, something here is either missing or something is misbehaving, or here's a whole new category of data or signals that we could be looking at that we haven't looked at before. Or, hey, do you know how much cognitive bias is actually affecting the operations of your environment that maybe you want to look away from and, reconsider the way that it works? And that added to the ability to explain itself, it really does become an advisor. Right? That takes that second step of what would normally be a human process of, hey, great kid, those are awesome ideas, love it, let me go do some research, but actually includes the research so that at that moment, they are now in the role of an advisor. That when that data and that insight comes to you, it's packaged not only with all the unknown unknowns that are a critical component of what it's bringing you, but also an explanation so that you can get right to that issue. So again, I absolutely, I mean, it sounds to me like this will actually be a real benefit for folks in IT, and especially because, most people I know, most admins I know, it's a calling, right? People come to technology to deliver services because they are ultimately providing services to other humans. I mean, there's tons of APIs and other things where it's machines talking to machines. But at the end of the day, we want to make people's weekends better. We want to provide, really great experiences to them. So this sounds like it's actually focused on that goal, right? To be able to really enhance the human experience of dealing with the end services of IT. So not just the exhaust fumes, but actually, the real value that it's delivering. Where before we're just busy working with a lot of detail that doesn't necessarily get reflected in new benefit to end users.
Yeah, I mean, imagine having that incredibly well-informed advisor that can not only be telling you about things that are going on you need to pay attention to, but can help you strategize on ways that the technology can be delivering greater value to the business. Provide answers to open-ended questions, right? Are there ways to address some of the challenges and concerns that Acme Corp has around customer retention, based on past, 12 months or whatever? They can reason over that and they can bubble up some insights, and those insights may be of, greater or lesser relevance. But I think having that advisor, as you called it, Patrick, I think is going to be incredibly, incredibly powerful. And again, I think we're just touching the tip of the iceberg at this point.
I think it's really exciting, opening up the possibility for more people to get the computer to do the work for them, right? So they can focus on the stuff that they want to and the things that really bring value. Mike, thanks for joining us today. If people want to find out more about you, where can they do that?
Sure, Josh. Yeah, obviously I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to jump in on that, it's linkedin.com, MJ Nappi, I think. And I'd love to hear from people. This AI space is evolving constantly. I'd love to get people's feedback on some of the things we talked about.
Well, excellent.
Today.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate you hitting that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. We're hosted on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and many other platforms. We're adding new podcasts on a regular cadence. And you can access all of our podcasts at ScienceLogic.com/podcast.